Harvard professor Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel was a hugely popular best-selling anthropology book in the 1990s. Jared Diamond's central thesis posits that Europeans were able to conquer vast territories through advanced weaponry and superior transportation. A third factor emphasized by Diamond was the introduction of diseases by Europeans to native populations, to which these populations had little to no immunity. Diamond. The importance of lethal microbes in human history is well illustrated by Europeans' conquest and depopulation of the New World. Continuing, far more Native Americans died in bed from Eurasian germs than on the battlefield from European guns and swords. The African continent. European settlers first arrived on the South African coast in the early 1600s. The first Dutch settlers named it the Cape of Good Hope. The climate in southern Africa was agreeable to Europeans, being mild and temperate, similar to that of the European continent. Exotic diseases did not pose a significant problem for the settlers. But as the settlers moved inland, they encountered not only hostile African tribes, but also an even more insidious force: disease. Diamond, PBS miniseries. The settlers themselves began to fall ill with terrible fevers, while all around them they could see native Africans farming, herding cattle, healthy and alive. European slave traders between the 1600s and 1800s similarly lacked resistance to African maladies such as malaria. They were particularly vulnerable when they ventured inland from port cities, facing very high mortality rates, up to 50% by some estimates. Mortality rates for Europeans were especially high in and around the port cities of West Africa. Malaria and sickle cell resistance. Continuing, PBS series. Native Africans had developed antibodies against one of the most virulent diseases on Earth, malaria. Carried by the humble mosquito, this was the disease that was now overwhelming the European settlers. According to Science Daily, a gene allele evolved in the African population that offers protection against Plasmodium vivax. Over tens of thousands of years, selective pressures have worked to give Africans greater immunity. Geneticists such as Sarah Tishkoff have asserted that blood disorders like sickle cell disease persist in human populations because they confer partial resistance to malaria infection. Sickle cell explained. From verywellhealth.com, people living with sickle cell trait have a significant reduction in the number of malarial parasites living in the body. Thus, a Darwinian selective advantage. Continuing, the infected red blood cell isn't able to stick as easily to the walls of the blood vessel. Finally, decreased parasite growth may allow more time for the immune system to react to and destroy the infected RBCs. When a child inherits the sickle cell allele from one parent, they gain a selective advantage against malaria. Conversely, when a child inherits the sickle cell allele from both parents, they are more likely to develop sickle cell anemia. The mutation causes some red blood cells to have a curvature similar to a sickle cell shape. MayoClinic.com. With sickle cell, some red blood cells are shaped like sickles or crescent moons. It affects the shape of red blood cells, which carry oxygen to all parts of the body. According to the World Health Organization, approximately 80 million Africans are inflicted with sickle cell anemia. And according to the CDC, approximately 100,000 Americans are inflicted with sickle cell anemia. 90% of them are Afro ethnics. Sadly, 30 to 50% of African children with sickle cell anemia die before the age of 5. Survivors often endure severe anemia, fatigue, chronic pain, and frequent infections. Spatial and temporal origination of the sickle cell mutation. From the BBC, Tracing Sickle Cell Back, 2018. For decades, scientists have wondered whether the mutation happened just once or whether it happened at different times in different places. A study was released in 2018 that traced the mutation back to 7.3 thousand years ago. The researchers assert that the mutation first occurred in just one child. From the Sickle Cell Foundation, African medical literature reported this condition in the 1870s when it was known in some areas as Ogbunjes, children who come and go. Continuing, there are reports of the condition tracking back to 1670 in one Ghanaian family. Continuing from the BBC, once upon a time, in what is now the Sahara Desert, a child was born with heightened immunity to malaria in this part of Africa that was wet and rainy and covered with forest. Continuing, this child with the genetic mutation lived and had children, and those children spread out, all bolstered with extra defenses against malaria and living for longer, and their descendants continued to spread. Note aside, the abbreviation HBB stands for the hemoglobin beta gene. This gene provides instructions for making this beta globin, which is the protein in red blood cells that carries oxygen throughout the body. Study 2021. There is now overwhelming evidence for the single African origin of HBB-S variant, likely in the rainforest in the vicinity of the present day's Cameroon, at least 7,000 years ago. Continuing, the report of all 5 classical HBB haplotypes in Cameroon suggests a much longer presence of HBB in this region. Note aside, regular viewers of this channel will recognize Dr. Wonkum, who conducted the study, from our previous videos on African archaic hominid DNA admixture. Dr. Wonkum, globalhealthnow.org. As Africa's population evolved, those without the single mutation would often die of malaria, and those who had 2 copies of the gene would die of sickle cell disease. Continuing, that's why the single mutation became extremely common in Africa as populations settled, became more agriculturalist, and expanded. Europeans' lack of immunity. This difference in the prevalence of the sickle cell trait between African and European populations is a clear example of how human genetic variation can be shaped by environmental factors and evolutionary pressures. European settlers suffered a devastating impact from malaria in Africa during the colonial era. The settlers lacked immunity to malaria because they did not inherit the sickle cell mutation. If geneticists are correct that the HBB mutation occurred within the last 10,000 years, that would suggest a significant divergence in the evolutionary paths of Africans and Europeans. Anthropologists of an earlier era, influenced by the prevailing scientific paradigms of their time, would almost certainly have deemed this genetic divergence sufficient to taxonomically classify Africans and Europeans as separate subspecies. If the researchers advocating for multiple spatial and temporal origins of the sickle cell mutation are correct, the implications would be even more profound. It would strongly suggest that West Africans acquired this mutation through sexual introgression with an archaic hominid species. This, of course, would be entirely consistent with the 2020 study by Sankararaman and Dervasula, which found up to 19% archaic hominid DNA admixture in West Africans. To date, there have been no studies from geneticists as to whether there is a link for the malarial mutation to archaic hominid DNA admixture. Note: Arizona State University professor Dr. Michael Hammer was actively investigating genetic divergence between Europeans and Africans in the early 2010s, with a specific focus on Cameroon. However, in 2014-15, he mysteriously halted his research. In our next episode in the series on separate genetic inheritance for Europeans and Africans, we'll explore a mutation found in saliva that has a surprising connection to our ancient ancestors. Thanks for watching, y'all. Be sure to subscribe. We'll see you soon.